Codemotion.
Okay. Hello. I hope you guys are in the right place. This is cutting the fat, when to use AJAX and when to reload. My name is Tiffany, and I work as an interaction designer at SoundCloud. Just a show of hands, who knows SoundCloud? Okay, so I just want to let you know I don't work on the product that everyone sees. I work on internal tools. That's sort of my specialty. If you have opinions about the actual customer-facing product, I am on the design team, so feel free to let me know. But I actually don't work on that product directly. So yeah, I'm a front-end developer at SoundCloud, and my Twitter handle is Tiffany if you want to find me anywhere. So cutting the fat. This is a talk about being pragmatic. It's a talk about how to reduce the technical complexity of web applications. Specifically, I'm talking about web applications. And it's a talk about using interaction design to help make the choice between AJAX and reloading the page. So it's as much for developers as it is for designers. And it's as much about learning each other's terminology as making the decision. So last summer, there was a conference called the Throne of JS in Toronto. I did not attend, but my colleague did. And the conference had a very specific premise. The Throne of JS is focused on answering the question on every web developer's mind. Which framework? One conference about just that. Yes, rich interactive web applications are now commonplace. And there are so many frameworks for building these rich web applications that the debate among developers is which one to use. And I would like to question this premise. Not entirely. I think you need to make a choice. But I think we need to step back and ask ourselves, why don't we just reload the page? We need to remind ourselves why we don't reload the page and think about the benefits and the costs of that. And frameworks help us solve specific technical problems, but maybe we can just avoid some of these problems entirely. And so what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to cover some basic terminology that some of you will know some of the terminology and some others you won't. Hopefully, by the time we get through the terminology, it's all agreed. Then I'm going to talk about the benefits and the costs of AJAX. And then I'm going to give my pragmatic approach for how I make this distinction. So let's get started. AJAX versus reload. So we're just going to recap what AJAX is, what we use it for, and how it is different from just a page reload. So back in the early 90s, all web pages had blue links. And when you would mouse over a link, it would turn purple, and you would click it. And in that moment, the whole page would reload. This was the web. This is a page reload. In the second half of the 90s, after JavaScript was introduced, a JavaScript object called XML HTTP request was introduced, which allowed content to be sent and loaded asynchronously without reloading the whole page. And in 2005, the technique of loading the content asynchronously with JavaScript was given the name AJAX. And around that time, Google released Gmail and Google Maps. And we started to see the power of this technique. AJAX allows us to just change part of the page. So a common use when it first came out was a news ticker that would automatically upload and change without reloading the page. And that's not the most exciting use case. The more exciting use case is when the user is actually interacting with the page, it sends information and brings back the result without actually reloading the page. So just so we are all on the same page, an example, Facebook messages. Franks asks, what was the name of that restaurant? This is Facebook messages, which hopefully everybody's seen. So I start typing my response to him. And then I decide I'm going to paste a URL in here. So I do that. And so he can find it. And the moment that I paste this URL without me doing anything, Facebook loads that URL. And they load content and a picture from that. And I haven't done anything. I just am now able to say, yeah, that's actually the page I was trying to point to. And it pulls in a bit of the information. And then when I send the message, Facebook pushes that information and without reloading the page, transforms it into a sent-looking thing, and now I see it. And the whole time, the page didn't reload. So what AJAX allows us to do is it allows us to keep the context of what we were doing without reloading the page. One of the earliest uses of AJAX that I ever experienced was there was a web version of an IRC chat room. And if you wanted to know what anybody had said, you had to press refresh on the page so it would load things that people had said. And then if you actually wanted to type something, you would like spend some time typing it, and then you would press enter, and then it would like reload the page. And the amazing thing was when you could actually type and get messages while you're typing, and then you could send it, and it would just keep, and this was mind-blowing. So this is what AJAX allows us to do, to keep context. So that's my statement. AJAX allows us to maintain context. And the web stopped being a collection of static websites with fixed content, and we could exchange data without reloading the page. But now, we rely really heavily on AJAX for all of our user experience, controlling that experience. So yeah, it allows us to maintain the context. So let me just define really what I mean by context. So context is the answer to the question, where are you? And I don't mean like I'm on the street, I'm mobile, I'm in the toilet. I mean, where am I in the application? What am I doing there? And when you're designing an instance of a context, if you're a designer, you might call this a view, or you might call it a screen. But basically, a good example here would be, this is the Facebook timeline. And this is my profile, or timeline, or whatever they call it now. And then over there is Sun Moon's timeline. And these are actually two different contexts. This one is me, and this one is Sun Moon. These are separate contexts, even though they are the same. They're in two instances of the same kind of context. Another really popular example is multiple parts of the same workflow. So in this example, I've got a form, and then I did some form validation there, and then the user submits it, and I tell them everything's OK. And all of these pieces of a sequence are just the same context. The context is filling out the form. So as designers, we need to define and understand what these different contexts are and how they relate to each other. And just some examples of different kinds of context would be a user's profile. A news feed is one context. It's kind of reloading on its own. When you're doing a store checkout, you want to control that whole flow. A slideshow, it's so awful when you press click and then it like reloads the page and then like positions it to a new spot, and really you just want to see the next picture. Yeah, that's one context, regardless of what advertisers might want. So when we make a transition from one context into the next, we sort of exit the boundary of one context and enter the other. AJAX could be used to control this transition. And that's the case if the designer and the developer can sort of negotiate the cost benefits, so the benefits versus the cost. And so this deciding to go between contexts is the piece that we want to look at especially. So we said that AJAX maintains context, and when you have a lot of AJAX on your page, that's called a fat client. So I'm just going to compare fat client versus thin client. So what do we mean by a fat client? So a client, just to say, is the code that's in the browser. So the web server's there, it goes across the network, and then all the code that's running in the browser, that's the client in this discussion. So a thin client is when you have all of the data and all of the logic on the server, and it goes over the network, and all you get is presentation. That's a thin client. A thick client is when you have the data on one side, and it pushes it over the network, whether it's templates and as well as data, and all of the logic is done in the browser. That's a fat client. And when we talk about fat clients, we often talk about a native experience. And what we mean here is we want AJAX to allow us to emulate a native experience, meaning to control transitions. That's one of the major things that a native experience allows you to do. So a page reload transition is the page goes white, and then stuff loads. In a native experience, you can have like a slide or a fade, or maybe it like flips over. And those are the sort of transitions we don't have on the web. We just have page reload. So with AJAX, we can actually control these transitions. So all this time I've been talking a lot and moving towards talking about single-page apps and whether or not they're awesome or not awesome. That's sort of, do we want to have a single-page app or not? A fat client is one where all of the transitions are controlled by AJAX, and we never actually reload the page. The problem is that they're nasty, technically complicated things. So as we're trying to recreate this native experience, we run into all kinds of problems. So once upon a time, if the URL changed, the page would reload. Simple as that. And if it didn't change, we could just do everything within one page. But then we had this problem where we thought, OK, well, now I can't use the back button. This is a problem, because I can't actually change state backwards. We also had this problem where your application could reach some state that you couldn't reach otherwise. And so we talked about deep linking. We couldn't deep link to something. And then we thought, oh, well, we'll solve this with hash bangs, because that's changing the URL, right, without actually going anywhere. And that meant that we had to have this thing called a JavaScript router, which is basically doing the job of the server to look at where you are in the application. And we had to add that. And then we thought, oh, well, maybe we can control this with window history. We can do this magic with this JavaScript thing. And now we need a framework to control all of that, because it's just so much to handle. So before we were using AJAX to control transitions and to load everything, we didn't have any of this problem. So let's just pause and think, why? OK, so we added all these complications. Why do we want AJAX at all? So there must be some benefits. The problems that a fat client solves. First one is continuous interaction. That's the obvious one. The page isn't reloading while the user's actually interacting. The next one is the transitions between contexts, this idea of sliding or fading or flipping. Incremental loading. One second. This one is obviously you can load part of the page, and then you can load other parts of the page afterwards, not have to wait for everything before you start doing something. Lastly, reducing network traffic. The idea being that if you just are sending data, then you don't have to send the whole thing, and it's less traffic. So I would say, I'm declaring that these are pretty well designed problems, mostly. Obviously, reduced network traffic sounds a lot like a technical problem. But these are design problems that we're solving here. Let's look at the problems that a fat client causes. Routing. I mentioned this one before. It's the idea that as the URL changes, we have to understand what that means. Previously, we would just tell the server, I'm at this new address, what should I do? And then it would decide. And now we have to keep track of what does each route mean? What does each URL mean? History. It's this idea that you can change the state, but you have to remember what state you were in if you're going to be able to allow people to use the back button. Caching and garbage collection. So if you just have a single-page app and you're constantly loading data, and you are, maybe you're going to need that data on the next page, but how do you know that until you you have to keep track of whether or not to keep that around or just fetch it again? So have you really solved the problem? And then just explicitly letting that go and let it be collected by the browser. And then the computation is outside of our control. So the problem is that we have no idea what kind of computer the person on the other side has. This is the cross-browser compatibility issues where you don't know what they have over there. And previously, you would do all the work on your side. And if things were slow, you could maybe make your server be faster and then just fire out things. So now we've got that all outside of our control. And these are definitely technical problems, right? This has got nothing to do with design. It's all about technical problems. So you might, as a designer, say, well, you know what? That's actually not my problem. That's what frameworks are for. Solve this problem. Just do that. Solve that problem. So one problem is you might be the person who's also implementing the JavaScript code. So it might be your problem. But let's just look again at the design problems that a fat client solves. Just to reiterate, continuous interaction, transition between contexts, and incremental loading. So I would call this first one, continuous interaction, maintaining context. So context doesn't change. There's no jarring changes. You just keep in the same context. Obviously, the second one is transitions between contexts. And then the last one I would call that establishing context. So you can see where you are, you can see a spinner, you know what's going to happen, and then they load up into place. All of this is about controlling the context. Again, that's why we have it. But AJAX adds complexity. So we think, OK, maybe there's some kind of trade-off here. I want context, but it's too complex. So let's just look again at the problems that are solved here. And maybe we can pick one that's like the most important. OK? I think that continuous interaction is the most important reason why we would use AJAX. My opinion. We can discuss whether you disagree. But if we didn't care about that, we would just reload the page. So examples of continuous interaction, I think you can probably think of them. You're watching a video, you want to comment on the video. You're having a conversation with someone. You're performing a search, you want to see how well that search is going. So the least important one, I actually think it's transitions between contexts. I think that's the least important thing. Basically, if you have a new context, just reload the page. That's basically the entire idea. So you might think, oh, but transitions, they're so cool, and like they help the user like see where you're going. Yeah, that's really nice. Okay? All the cool kids are doing it. They're all making these single-page apps. Okay, I'm going to talk about one very cool kid that I think is very cool. GitHub. Hands up if you know GitHub. Okay? So they're arguably the coolest kids right now. And I'm going to play a short video and explain what's happening in the video. I'm just going to do a little case study with GitHub. And I'm going to show you that they do not use AJAX when they switch contexts. So this is GitHub. This is my friend Jan's profile. This is his user profile. And I'm just going to open up the console. And I'm going to go to the Network tab. And I'm going to show Documents. And basically, whenever you reload the page, it'll load a new document here. So if the page reloads, this is going to change. But if it doesn't reload, it'll stay the same. So now I'm going to go to these tabs, repositories. OK, the page did not reload. Public activity. Despite what I said, the page didn't reload. Let's try going to a repository. So now we've left the context of Jan. We're in a repository. The page reloaded. Here we have the file system. We're going through. The page is not reloading. It's transitioning. I can use the back button. That's all very cool. We go to the commits. The commits does a page load. It's totally a separate context from the file system. Go to pull requests. These are the lists of the pull requests. Maybe I would like to look at the closed ones. Page doesn't reload. We're in the context of pulls. Now I'm going to go to a single pull request. And this is my favorite one, because right here we have all the discussion about this pull request. Here's the commits that were in it. Here's the files that were changed. And in the discussion, you've got a couple places to comment. You can either comment there, or you can go here. And I can do an inline comment. So find somewhere to comment. Maybe here. Leave the comment. What? You can preview that without reloading the page, obviously. And then if we go back to the discussion, I haven't actually submitted that comment. It's just sitting there. I'm a bit of a scatterbrain. I make comments in more than one places at one time. See my other comment, which I didn't actually submit yet. So I'm going to go back there and look at it. So it's still there because they haven't reloaded the page. Now, if I go to a different repository entirely, I'll go to this page. It does a page reload because a new pull request is a new context. So I can go back. I'm back here. It's gone. My comment that I was trying to make is gone because I switched context and came back. So obviously, I was done thinking about that repository. Why would I ever go to another repository unless I was done thinking about it? So as we saw, GitHub is a collection of single-page apps, one per context. And with each page reload, with each new context, there's a page reload in between. And they're probably using a framework for each of those page reloads, each of those single-page contexts. So AJAX or reload, when should you use it? first of all, just limit your demand for AJAX to when it's really valuable. When you're trying to maintain the continuous interaction, if you're not maintaining context with AJAX, that's where you should start doing it first. Single-page apps are often made for the wrong reason. I've done it. I've made a single-page app I shouldn't have done. So where is our need for AJAX at all? In order to find out where to use it, first you got to find all of the interaction points. So anytime the user clicks or hovers over something that has an effect, all of these are interaction points. And each one of those, we probably are using JavaScript and maybe AJAX. So which ones can we eliminate? We have to find the boundaries between each context. When have I switched context? Maybe it looks the same, but it's actually a totally new, like, why would I go there unless I'm done with the previous thing? So find the context boundaries, and that's where you can divide your application into more than one single-page app. And for developers, always ask, does my framework minimize my technical costs? I mean, that's the question you should ask, right? You shouldn't ask, like, is this pure? Are we following the best practices of separation of concerns? Is it actually solving your technical costs? Is it minimizing your technical costs? So single-page apps, yes. We can help our users maintain context so they can focus without jarring interruptions. That means use AJAX for each context, and each of those can be a single-page app. Basically, monolithic apps, no. Should you have a single app for your entire thing? No, you should break it up. There are some exceptions, if anyone can think of one. Twitter, I have no idea why they think that it has to be one. They do it. I have no idea why. Yeah? A game. A game is one context, right? You're doing one thing. The context is playing the game. Anything that's really immersive, so-called immersive, that's it. You're in it. That is a real use case. Lots of people at this point mentioned SoundCloud. SoundCloud is a single-page app. The whole site is one page. There is one reason why SoundCloud was built as a single-page app. We only wanted one new feature. We decided to do a redesign, but there was one new feature, continuous listening. Listening is the context. So it doesn't matter what else you're doing, you want to be listening the whole time. I suppose if the person's not playing a song, you could reload the page, but we've already solved those technical problems. The fact that they're not listening kind of doesn't change the fact. But if you ask anybody at SoundCloud who works on that part of the code, one of the biggest challenges is actually memory management and caching. That's the hard part of the problem. Facebook is also a one-page app. If you go to if you do the little experiment that I did and you look at their output, what you'll see is they get new documents being added. And that means that they're using an iframe. They're using iframes to load them. And I think that's actually just because they support IE6. So they have to load things through an iframe because they probably get items from different CDNs and things. But the real reason why they don't reload the page is because they have a chat feature. And it doesn't matter what you're doing, you're chatting, right? So that's why they don't have it. So anytime there's a continuous thread across your app that's totally unrelated to what they're looking at, that's a reason. Other than that, I will take questions. Yeah? Yeah. I'll repeat what you said. I didn't hear a question, but maybe there's just a comment, which is more and more you see that companies have a single-page app, and it's really about the experience.
Yes, you made the example of GitHub, but GitHub is a site for us developers.
Yeah.
So the user experience is not so important with respect to the features.
Right. So again, the idea is that with GitHub, it's a very sort of nerdy site, and for us, it's okay that the page reloads, and we don't care about experience as much. And so maybe that's why they don't do it there. And you're just, again, making a comment, which is that lots of sites care about this experience thing. And this is what I'm talking about. If you want to control the transition between contexts for some kind of feeling, then you need to ask, is that feeling that I'm able to get from that transition worth all of the work of having a single page app? Is that an expense that my business can afford for a fade? That's the question, like, can I afford that? Or the other thing is, maybe I could choose not to do it at first and then think about how am I going to transition between them as a separate problem. Did you, somebody over here?
No, I just want to comment about this thing that I work a little bit on the UI, and I think the GitHub is one very good example of maximizing the page load. The speed of even the reload is very fast because there is a very lightweight all the thing. If you compare, for example, with one button in Grid, it's like 10 levels of nesting of divs and the tables and the but if you do it, I think this is the point, like to have a presentation layer, everything on the server, the database and the.
So you're talking about the idea that the GitHub page load is really fast. It's extremely fast, even between page loads. So you're suggesting, I guess, that the presentation is done on the server side, and then just push to the front.
They just send you the HTML.
Right. They just send you the HTML, which is still sure. So they're doing a combination thing where they're doing up front. They're doing a lot of computation on the back, and then they only send the incremental changes, which are then also rendered. Yeah, sure. But the most important part for me is that when it doesn't matter, they just reload the page. You had a question, yeah? Or can you start again and a bit louder?
I wonder whether there is a different meaning of context from the developer point of view and from the user point of view. Because by looking at the GitHub example, I would say that your front page, the switch between your front page and a specific project page, that's certainly a switch of context for the user and for the while switching and transitioning between the project page and the comments, the page for the comments or the page for the request. It's debatable whether it's transitioning for the user.
Right. So the point that he's making is that the context switch for the user and the context switch for the developer might be different, or.
What I'm saying is switching to the two request page is certainly a transition for the developer because it's already.
Right, but so you're saying that it's the context switch for the developer, meaning the developers of GitHub? Yeah, so it's absolutely a context switch, but the choice to make that switch of a new app is based on whether or not, I mean, if my point is this, if it turns out for the developer that it's trivial to switch from context A to context B without doing a page reload, they could do that. The point I'm trying to make is that from the design perspective, be very clear about where the transition breaks can be so that the developer can choose to break up the application in that way. So that the developer can say, I'm just going to tear the page down and send an entirely new app out at that point because it was communicated to me that that was a break. If it turns out that the context between the file viewer, for instance, the file viewer in GitHub is one context and then the commits tab is one tab away, it might be trivial for the developers of GitHub to make those the same context. It might be trivial. They could choose to make that one if they want. But when they're like, oh, it's really hard for us to transition from files to another repository, the designer can say, that's cool. That's a different thing. Go ahead and make the change there.
That's reasonable.
Yeah, this is about where you can reload the page if you can not afford to transition it some other way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, right. So the question was whether I see a difference between the same ideas on mobile versus on the desktop. And the major point is that this technical problem of having a fast network speed actually becomes a design problem because you're waiting so long for the next thing that it's actually a serious user experience problem that you're waiting for it to reload. And this is where I say that you have to balance the cost and the benefit. So the cost of reloading is really cheap in terms of the front-end development, but the cost of reloading for the user to wait for everything to be sent again is too high. And so I absolutely see a difference. I think that it's important that your mobile site be fast. I do not think that it's important that your site preload and slide. I don't think that's necessarily important. Is it important that your user knows that you're loading something and you do it as fast as possible and then it immediately switches? That's important. So it's all about trade-offs for me. Yes?
I think there is one more reason to use AJAX on the client.
OK, one more reason to use AJAX is?
I see some architecture when the client has to interact with some, for instance, from REST to web service in order to fetch data.
Sorry, I missed when the client has to what?
The client has to interact with some web services and REST services.
Yeah.
In order to get data from some application.
Then that's why they would? OK, so his example was that you need to use AJAX because your client needs to talk to an API. I write a product where the server talks to the API. I don't have to get JavaScript to talk to that API. I could say, hey, server, I want this new page. And then it's like, OK, I need to actually get other data from somewhere else. I mean, we think about connecting to a database as something that the web server does. But the database could just be at the end of an HTTP request. So it's not mandatory that your client talk directly to the API. Might be faster, might be less network traffic, but you don't need it. I don't think you need to directly talk. It's not better to go through your web server. Unless it is? Yeah. Yes?
Yes, I want to follow up on that one. Because yes, it works if you have your server or some API that you can use. But then, for instance, say the like buttons from Facebook, they depend on getting the cookies that are in your browser, not the cookies that
right.
the server has.
OK, so his example was that I'm wrong because there are some APIs that require browser cookie information.
Not that you're wrong, but...
No, but I'm wrong. I'm mistaken in that instance, that there are some APIs that are specifically expecting browser-side stuff. Yeah, that's valid.
Another reason why I prefer AJAX calls instead of really limiting pages is generally avoiding the waste, because often the page is
almost the same. Yeah.
The same header, the same footer, the same menu,
yeah.
And just the center, the content.
Yeah.
And more often I see that maybe I have to reload a new context, which is different, but it's quite the same as the city one.
So his benefit of using AJAX is that the difference between the first page and the second page is just a little bit of data, and it seems inefficient to get the entire presentation and then reload the page with the entire presentation with something small changed. So,
and also other things like tracking code for an
sure, all these other sort of resources have to be loaded. And I would say that the solution that I think of with that is I have this application where everything is loaded as single components, and JavaScript builds the presentation. And then I don't worry about maintaining history. I just reload the entire page, and all of the resources that should be the same are already cached. And all you need to really get is the new thing. And so then you're hoping that the cache headers are valid, and that when you ask for the resources again, they aren't actually fetched again. You rely on HTTP to caching to not be so dumb as to get again everything that's the same. And this is what I meant by JavaScript now has to deal with caching, as opposed to just get all the resources and assemble them on this front, and then tear everything down with a page reload, but only get back just the new data. That's sort of how I see it. So I have an application where every page, the markup is just one div, and I load everything into it with templates. But if I change the route, I actually just tear everything down and build it up again. And I can do that because everything is already cached. Yes?
I was thinking, like filling a form, if there's a very long form.
Yes.
I've stepped across cases where the form is actually split in sort of a wizard thing. And what I think right now is the context. It can be considered the same because the action is like very atomic.
Mm-hmm.
But personally, and I was wondering to know what you think, I didn't feel that too much of an hassle to have the page reload, no matter if I was in the same context, because I had filled already a few fields and then I was pushing like next. It was alright. It wouldn't be like much worse if I just had a
right. So what you've done, so he's giving the example of a multi-page form, and at the end of each part, he's compelled to just submit it and get the next one. And I said that's one context. And I think that these are subcontexts, and that's valid. It's valid for you to say, like, OK, the user wants to have confidence that I've saved that. They're done with that part. I've broken it up into these contexts. Yeah, the overall thing is filling out the form, but you've said, oh, actually, filling out your address is the first thing. Let's establish that and then do the next thing. So it's all about really deciding where it's important or not.
Yeah, so you can't kind of like enforce the context to the user, like
yeah,
your personal data.
And then they have confidence that you've saved it and you're on to the next thing. Yeah. So I think other people are coming in, which makes me think, oh, yes. So the question is, if we're going to do it incrementally and decide that an interaction uses reload, and then we can later change it to AJAX, when do you decide to switch? Do you do it at the beginning or not? For me, I do whichever one's easiest first. I'm like, this is just easier for me to reload the page. Sometimes it's not easier. It's really about making it. And this, if you saw earlier when they were talking about rapid prototyping, when you're prototyping something, just make it work, and then you can be like, yeah, that page reload isn't going to happen in the real thing. And then you can figure out how to solve that problem separately. I feel like other people are coming in, and maybe my time is up. Yeah. OK, so if you have any other questions, we can talk about it later. Great.
Codemotion.